Okay. So this is the Planning Board Subcommittee meeting of July 14th. It's just a little after 4 o'clock. And this meeting is recorded by video and audio in accordance with state open meeting law pursuant section 20 of chapter 20 of the Acts of 2021. This meeting will be conducted by remote participation. Additionally, all votes taken by the Planning Board Subcommittee during this and future remote meetings will be by roll call vote. And we'll see if the legislature does anything about that, hopefully by tomorrow. Otherwise, we're going to be in an interesting situation for next week with meetings that have already been scheduled and posted as remote meetings. So members are David Rosen is the chair, Jane Remsen is member, and Rick Noonan is an alternate today as Beverly Bookin is out of town on travel. So if Mr. Chairman, you'd like to call the meeting to order?
I call the meeting to order.
Okay. And
Having never done this before,
there you go.
little guidance here.
Okay.
It's good practice.
I think you just did it. So and I've already introduced, I jumped ahead and introduced the subcommittee members, and then also on the call is Gemma Wilkins, staff planner, and Ann Herbst from the MAPC, who's assisted in the development of the draft floodplain ordinance that was presented in an overview at the planning board meeting of June 16th. We've had a nice little hiatus. So we thought it made sense to kind of, break this down a little bit into a subcommittee to talk a little bit more about it. And also, the overall architecture, I think, as Anne presented, is fairly, it's using models of other ordinances that are out there. And at some point, we might be a little bit ahead of the curve. There have been a number of communities that, as changes have been made to their floodplain mapping, there's been a need to kind of update their ordinances as well to be compliant and continue to participate in the National Flood Insurance Program. And so what Anne had presented was kind of that framework. And a lot of what we kind of talked about and presented that's a little bit different than the state model is whether or not this ordinance also potentially expands to pushing folks to really think about areas that might be flood prone in the future. And again, the way that this is kind of set up, it's not intended to be a new permitting process per se. It's more establishing the jurisdiction, and then whenever you're involved in kind of any type of permitting, whether it's a special permit from the city council, planning board, zoning board, a subdivision, conservation jurisdiction, you have a new kind of set of standards to be looking towards, but they're not, they're really kind of reliant on those standards that exist in these areas. So it's really a lot of awareness and making sure that people are addressing the potential risk that they might face with constructing in these areas. One area in particular that we kind of talked about a little bit, but didn't go very far into, is whether or not there is any thought about applying any standard above and beyond establishing the jurisdiction and the guidelines that are in it. There was a proposal, or is a proposal, from the state to potentially regulate particularly the high hazard areas that are referred to as velocity zones in such a manner that you wouldn't be able to promote new residential construction in those areas, and also maybe limits on expansion. And then in some communities, Anne pointed out that they've also done that on their own already, and also put limitations on redevelopment and new construction in A zones, which are also certainly at risk, but not at risk to the same degree as velocity zones. So I don't know if you wanted to add anything beyond that, Anne, or whether that's a good summary.
Yeah, I think that is, in terms of the floodplain overlay. Basically, everybody who would apply for a building permit would fill out that short form that would describe whether they're in a area projected to have be affected by sea level rise in the future, and talk about what they intend to do about it, although it doesn't come with requirements to do or not do things, but simply to address it. But then, and then the other big changes would be the V zone and A zone restrictions.
I'd find it helpful if I know that we went through this at the last planning board meeting. Could we just do a quick recap on it, Anne? Would
And
others
also-
find that helpful?
Yes, well, I was going to ask if we have access to that presentation because I was looking for
Yes.
it before the meeting and I couldn't find it.
Yes, and we will move all that into the planning board drive. And I was just noticing the same thing when I went to go grab it. I was like, oh, I thought we had put that into the drive. So Anne, I can either pull it up or if you'd like to.
I think if you can do it easily.
Yeah, I can do
okay.
it pretty easily.
And a
Hold on
quick
one second.
recap. We don't need to,
Yep,
I
sure.
just would like to
Right.
look at the slide with the salient
Yep,
points.
sure. Yeah, I think if you get it up, we can sort of skip down to.
Yep, 1 second. Okay, everybody can see that okay?
Yeah.
Yeah.
So pull down, let's see. I think it might be as far as slide 13 even. Okay, so yeah, this is the first slide. So this was the first piece for the floodplain overlay ordinance. It does a couple things. One is simply to get it up to date with what the state's going to require next time you have a new flood map. But it creates a future flood risk district that's looking at 2.4 feet of sea level rise. And for anybody, the way this would work is when you go to get a building permit, you would have it's a 2-page checklist that basically you would look at the maps and you would say whether your property is, what the projection is for future sea level rise. So you might say, well, it looks like where I am, there's a 50% chance of flooding with 2.4 feet of sea level rise, and they're predicting that there'd be 2 feet of water on the ground. And from there, they would need to fill out, what did you think about doing and what are you planning to do to address that? And that would be the long and short of it. So that would go through, it's essentially would be part of the building permit process that goes to the building department today. And I think we can go on.
Yeah, and I would just add, it also kind of is an educational tool when people are looking at real estate. They come in all the time and they ask us questions. We provide, typically, I will stand at the counter with somebody with a large display, show them the information that we have on the city website for a variety of different jurisdictions. And this would be just another tool to also inform. It's not to scare people, but the reality is there's some of these areas that might be at risk that aren't currently mapped. And I can tell you that a lot of folks, when they look at the floodplain mapping, they feel like they've hit the jackpot when they're not in it. But that mapping is not exact. And, it's a matter of, sometimes maybe not paying a premium, but then at the same time, a homeowner's policy doesn't protect you from flood. So, it's really also, I think, potentially a significant education piece to let, have people think about it. You kind of display it to them. They might be able to address certain things in grading of the site or siting on the site on a particular lot. But so that's the intent with the future flood risk district, which is something that's not in every floodplain overlay district that communities have. So it's really, this is where I think it's a little bit perhaps more progressive in trying to say, hey, let's think about this a little bit beyond just what's regulated by FEMA and really kind of go a little bit further.
So
Greg,
is there, go ahead, Jane.
So sorry, thanks. I know the Create a Future Flood Risk District is an ordinance change, but is a building permit checklist an ordinance change? I would think that would just be a regulation.
Well, Yeah, either way. So, I think it's also, I mean, there is we have kind of a permitting process for building that is, it hits relevant departments that review building permit applications. And, sometimes there's, a person is contacted and the jurisdiction doesn't apply and they just say, keep moving forward. Then others, like the engineering department, for instance, if the building project is greater than 500 square feet, there's a requirement for a drainage plan. The engineering department lets the applicant know. They may have known or not known. They prepare that filing, and then the engineering department signs off. So this will be kind of like a new step where they would be presented with this in the building permit process. If they're in this jurisdiction, they have to also address these concerns. They would go through that, and that will become a part of the record as well before they get to the approval step.
And then,
No,
and just,
It's a
So, like-
cost that's borne by the applicant, correct? To provide, they'd have to provide us an actual survey that shows the different elevations.
this wouldn't be a cost because what they need to look at they simply need to look at the map and fill out maybe after we've shared this, we could share the actual form, but
Yep.
basically you'd look at the map, see what it says, you'd say, this chance and that depth and that's really it. The language in the proposed ordinance says applications shall include a narrative on a form designated by the city describing proposed methods to minimize future flood impacts to the property and surrounding areas. So Jane, it is in the actual ordinance that
Okay.
they would need to do that.
Is there some question about the accuracy of the maps? Because I know that's been the case before, right? With the FEMA maps?
So these, I mean, I think with any maps, they're not exact. I mean, in the sense that it's a projection of future conditions. The FEMA maps are a projection of current conditions, so that they're similar in that sense. And probably, people would have even more doubt about it because it's projecting something in the future. But again, all they have to do is say what the map says and say how they thought about it. But
That's easy.
Yeah, I mean, I think they can either, take that as a, a data point and think about that in terms of their proposal or not, frankly. I mean,
Right. I mean, they could even fill it out and say, yes, I've thought of everything or I've looked at everything and I don't want to do any mitigations by.
I can't afford it. It's not practical. They
Yeah.
can say a lot of
Yeah.
things.
Yeah. So what's
But
this replace the outdated 5.5 lowlands using this?
yeah, so we currently have a provision that I think dates back to maybe the 70s. I'd have to look at the exact enactment of the ordinance. It's extremely outdated, and it doesn't make reference to current, basically the current vernacular of the floodplain itself. It requires a city council special permit in some scenarios. It used to be actually a little bit more broad. And there was a recognition by the council back, probably sometime before 2010, I think it was, where they felt like they were kind of very, kind of duplicating the process of the Conservation Commission.
Mhm.
And so they made some amendments that kind of took a whole class and category of projects out of their review. And so it's kind of a little bit of a relic. And rather than, having certain projects have to go to the city council with really kind of odd, outdated standards, we would basically place the new floodplain overlay district in that location in the zoning ordinance in 5.5 and basically abandon those three provisions that are in there right now. Again, many of which are, very outdated and kind of put in place this modern ordinance that that pertains to the floodplain.
Okay, and we'll get that language like the old one and the new one soon?
Yes.
So if you don't have the new, when you see it, I'm not sure if it's clear in there. In black ink is basically everything that the state provided, which is this is what a proper ordinance needs to say. And then there's actually fairly limited language in blue ink that are things we added. So we added a line to the purpose saying, that it also addresses sea level rise. And we added this future floodplain district. We added the restrictions in the A zone and V zone. And we added actually a couple of definitions for substantial improvement, because that's something that doesn't have to be included, but is very helpful for people to understand. So everything else is what the state requires.
So to the point that Jane was making, an applicant submits this, and it's the building department that's going to review this to see whether it's compliant or not with this future flood risk district?
So I think we envision that it's the review team that would include myself as well as conservation agent and the building inspector. We all kind of they'll upload that submission. We'll be able to review it, comment on it. And then that would be just for a project that didn't require any other type of permitting. So once there is a project that is within, so that's for those projects that are outside of the jurisdiction of the FEMA floodplain. So it's just for those that are, in the future scenario, there might be flooding in that location. It's just through the building permit process, and then the standards and language of the ordinance are kind of permeated throughout all the other permitting processes. So any board that's reviewing a project that's within the floodplain would be looking to the same ordinance for an applicant to respond to.
Okay. So I'm going to ask Greg and Ann as the experts on this. Given what we think is coming with sea level rise, what's the compelling reason for not doing this? Who does it hurt, and who gains?
So, I mean, I think the big question, and we'll try to separate the two. So it's one ordinance, but it's kind of like a jurisdiction that has two areas. So for the floodplain itself, and I'll make sure that we show the language. If you don't include what Ann's termed like the blue language of putting an actual additional standard in there, what this really does is establish this is where where these flood prone risk areas are, and allows for that to be a part of the discussion in a special permitting process, a variance process, a subdivision process. Whereas right now those questions might come up, but there's really no requirement of an applicant to address them. Whether you go beyond with additional standard is really the question of if you are going to place any type of limitation on construction, whether it be expansion or redevelopment or new construction. That's the real talking point here.
Mm-hmm.
I think for the future flood risk area, again, I see it as something proactive. We've all seen the models. We've all seen these discussions about how things are not trending in a positive way along the coastline, and it's raising awareness to folks that would otherwise not even think about this stuff in the areas that are now identified in this 2.4 foot of sea level rise scenario. So the pushback will probably be, why are you going to make me do something else? Or, again, kind of the heavy-handedness of government trying to tell me what to do, I suppose. But again, I think for what it's actually doing, it's trying to make people aware of there's a lot of inaccuracy with these lines, and sometimes it's not always in a conservative way. Sometimes it's, the impact is greater than it appears on a map. So that's my answer. Go ahead, Ann.
Yeah, I guess I would say, I don't see any real argument against asking, identifying where this is, what's projected to happen on a map and telling us what you think you're going to do about it, given that you can say you're not going to do anything about it, and it simply becomes part of the building permit process. I obviously, if you were to adopt language that restricts construction and additions in the V zone and the A zone, and restricts expansion in the A zone, that would have a lot of impacts on probably quite a few people. Certainly the A zone language would. And I could see why that might give pause. I think you will be doing something new, even, asking people Boston does it for, and Boston actually requires a lot more of people, but to the extent that sometimes cities don't want to be the first one to go forward, there might be some resistance there, but again, as a practical matter, it's far more educational than anything else at this point.
Yeah, the only thing I would add is some of the discussion around this over the last several years, and I'm not sure, Ann, you might be able to speak to this. I don't know if it's actually occurred, but I've definitely seen sessions where, some of the recommendations were for instance, for a conservation commission to establish a new jurisdiction where, here's your wetland resource, here's your floodplain or land subject to coastal storm flowage, which is their term for the floodplain, and now put a buffer on that of 100 feet or 200 feet, which might encapsulate these areas of potential future flood. But now you're saying you have to go through this new permitting process, which is time, expense, preparation of plan for something that most communities don't identify as a jurisdiction. So I think I agree with Ann. This is really, it's more of an education tool because, somebody makes the submission, fills out the application. It's not a yes or no. It's making them think about it. So making people think. That's the argument. Don't make me think. But I think it's similar in a lot of ways of, some communities deal with a process or a review process, either through a special permitting process or potentially an administrative process. And it's more, it's definitely less impactful to the applicant when it's an administrative process.
So this is asking them to provide, if I'm understanding, this is asking them to provide information that will be reviewed, but in and of itself, it does not have any teeth to say you can or cannot build in this district, right?
That's right. The other thing in terms of who does it impact, as it turns out, if you remember when we looked at the map of 2.4 feet of sea level rise, it actually adds very few additional properties. So essentially, it's not that different than the current flood zone, although with deeper and perhaps more frequent flooding. So it's not as if a whole and a large class of people who never had to think about the flood zone now have to think about flooding. It's pretty much the same areas.
And I think that, the thought about this too is if this is new construction and this is in the ordinance, and so as somebody goes along the development continuum and they're starting with, okay, I've figured out this is the property that I'd like to purchase, I'd like to develop. They start surrounding themselves with the folks that are going to help them, get through the process. This is hopefully on the front end and saying, here's some ways that you might develop the site a little bit more conservatively to be prepared so that it doesn't have a negative impact on the investment that you're making. So hopefully that's the way it's received.
And, one of the reasons not to require something is that we are limited to a large degree by what the building code allows. So for example, if it shows that there's going to be 3 feet of water on the ground, the city can't require them to build higher, but you can certainly suggest it. And hopefully people are thinking about that and building higher, even though the building code may not require it.
So in that permitting process, the documents have been reviewed, then field inspection, as-built inspection, whatever was contemplated or even drafted as a mitigation doesn't exist in the as-built condition. There's no recourse, right? It's just a box that says it's checked. It's, you acknowledged it. We decided not to go that way because we found, conditions weren't suitable. Thank you very much. And we're going to build our $3 million house, right? And
Anyway,
anyways,
Well, I mean, I think, if this is something that comes into play before, for instance, a drainage submission, or which is also, it's a grading and drainage submission. So they're, they still will present a plan if they say, we've done what we can do, or, we have concerns about doing anything else because we'd be elevating our property higher than our neighbors, whatever it might be. They're still going to produce a plan that'll get approved, and they have to build consistent with that. If they build the measures in, then that's what they'll be held to construct.
And I guess I would say, and we'll get to that, but this is all sort of as of right building permits. We separately, we have language that still doesn't have specific requirements, but has a little more teeth in the special permit process.
well, I look forward to seeing it all in writing. I mean,
Yeah.
right, like the draft ordinance.
And if you'd like, as long as we're here.
But it's 4:30 and I'm not running the meeting, but I'm more interested in the VE zone, which I think is more controversial and difficult.
Yeah, I guess I'd pull this up just to point out, the real crux of the discussion that we were having was, again, whether you're going to do something different there. The ordinance, again, would otherwise establish the jurisdiction, talk about, what the considerations are for folks to be thinking about through special permit, site plan, all those areas, and then really just, this isn't good to put this up right now. Let me go back to the, but really, whether or not that's an area that the board thinks that we should be moving in that direction. There certainly are a few lots that, have the potential to be developed in the V zone. There's not a million, it's not endless. And, the state has been looking at this as well. And so the question is, the form that you will see if those areas are developed is stilted structures, most likely. And so if there's not any additional regulation put in place, currently, they go through the conservation process, when, and depending upon the resource area that they're in, whether they're in a rocky coast or in a dune environment, they build to the construction standards that are required in those zones. And that's, it's not saying that you're not building in a high risk area. You're just using the standards that have been put in place for those areas, which, there's a question about whether or not, that goes far enough in terms of providing or minimizing that risk.
So was there, Jane and Rick, do we need something more on this particular, on the floodplain issue, the previous slide that we saw? Or do you want to move on? Because I think we still need to, I think for this meeting, I would just like to be able to, because I know we have a hard stop at 5. And I would just like to have what Ann had presented before, have us be updated on that. And we're probably going to have another meeting after this to discuss it.
Mhm. Yeah, I'm good to move forward. I know Jane had a question on the velocity stuff though.
Yeah, I'm ready to move forward. Yes.
You want me to put that back up, Ann?
I guess so, yeah. So we can go past that.
That
Okay.
part? Where would you like
I
to go?
think there. So that's one piece. That is an article in that would be in the ordinance, which is your floodplain overlay. The other piece was adding to all the special permit processes. Again, requirements that when adding to the site plan for any of those processes, again, that you would use these maps and you'd simply locate where is your property, how is it impacted. Let's go to the next slide, see if that shows us what we need. And here the idea is to one, require in a special permit that people identify that issue so it's known, and the other is to add this seventh factor that says vulnerability to flooding and flood damage, taking into consideration projections for sea level rise. So basically giving any of the special permit granting authorities the ability to take that into account and to condition things as they think necessary, or approve or disapprove as they think necessary. Again, understanding there are some limits about how you can condition things based on the building code. Not sure what's the next slide. That really may be it. I think this is really all kind of the same concept. Require the language in the site plan and provide some kind of review language in each area of the ordinance. So next slide. So it's special permits, site plan review, cluster development, same concept, and same for subdivision rules and regs, which are maybe less important for you now because that's something you could do on your own at some point. But I think that may be all we need.
Yeah, I think the rest was the background slides, just about the establishment of where the 2.4 came from.
So the idea is kind of the same, just handled a little bit differently, which is basically saying, however somebody's going to get a permit, whether it's by right, simply going through the building department, whatever the typical process is, or whether it's any special permit or site plan review process, you're going to have to identify what it looks like the impact is for 2.4 feet and either just talk about what you're going to do, or the special permit granting authority has the ability to condition, to make conditions based on that.
Again, I just need to see, because this is how my brain works, I just need to see all of this
Of course,
printed out of my printer.
of course, yeah. I'm sorry, I didn't realize you had.
That I can read
seen
it and put together the whole thing in my head. And I'm much more, this stuff all sounds great. And I think it's an easy sell to the public. The VE zone thing is really hard. So I think we should.
So just one question on the conditioning of permit granting authorities. Sometimes there's an overreach. I mean, so the intent obviously is that, you check the box, you draft what you say you're going to do, you get in front of a permit granted authority under site plan review or ZBA, and they say, whoa, you have to do this, right? And that becomes a condition of the special permit. Is that a contestable item if they say we don't believe that you have the authority because it's not a requirement at the state level, but it is now sort of seeping into the jurisdiction of a condition of a board that may or may not have that authority?
Well, I think the answer is that if you're in contradiction with the building code, that is a problem.
Right.
You can ask them to agree to, elevate 4 feet, but they don't have to do that. But there are other kinds of things you could talk about, we want you to move this building further over here. That's okay with the building code. We want to know we want you to have a written evacuation plan that you provide to tenants. It could be a whole lot of other kinds of things that wouldn't be a violation.
Okay.
And Anne, I'm sorry, Jane, and well, everyone. So I'm just going to put this up just because I grabbed the wrong one before, which was all the ways that Anne had taken, adding kind of that 7th provision in the various special permitting processes to consider. I'll forward this out. We'll put this all in the planning board drive. But as she mentioned, most of this language is from the model, from the state, in terms of
Mhm.
establishing the jurisdiction, making sure that it refers to the most updated FEMA maps and flood insurance study. And really, the only thing that's really kind of, really the crux and discussion point that you're bringing up was this particular area. Do you set a higher standard than the model, and starting to either regulate if you can build in these zones, particularly and it's just residential construction, or whether or not there's the potential for limitations in some of these areas. And I think I mentioned at the last meeting, again, it's one of those things of you have to kind of decide whether you think this is addressing concerns that you think need to be addressed. I think one thing is the risk. In some ways, this also potentially impacts the potential for, great expansion of a formerly smaller structure to a larger structure in these flood zones. So that's kind of like the other potential side effect of regulating the A zones is, as we have a fairly forgiving lot coverage. And so with that, we've certainly seen a number of structures that have been fairly modest and have been able to expand quite a bit. And this would have an impact for sure in those areas if you limited the expansion of those structures. So it's a sticky one for sure. It's no easy decision here, and that's why we're taking our time, because we're looking to the planning board to make some decisions and recommendations on this before it goes too much further.
And I just say, I guess, recognizing what James isn't following on Craig, I think that I presume the A zone restrictions would be equally contentious, but would also impact more people than the B zones.
Is that shown on the charts earlier in the presentation, the number of properties that would be affected?
Yep.
Yeah.
Okay.
I can go back to that if you'd like to see that too.
Don't need to see it now, but
Okay.
can take a look at it when this is up and available to us on the drive.
So my big question about this is what David asked about the other stuff, the special permitting stuff. Every time I brought this up with somebody, sort of like, what do you think about this? Their question is why? Why do you need to do it? What's the cost to Gloucester if you don't do it? Right? I mean, there's no requirement from the state that we have to do this. So what is the cost to Gloucester if we don't do this?
So I'll throw a couple of things out there. One is, I think, and it'll be an interesting question of what the state does, what individual communities decide to do. There's certainly potentially a negative real estate value perspective if these areas continue to get bombarded and their value just goes, to zero, or people can't reinvest in these areas because they're so prone. That's one thing to be considered.
Yeah,
And
but the
whether-
value is going to go to zero, Greg, if we do this also. So
For areas that aren't developed right now, it's a question of where do you want people to invest in real estate, for one. If
Okay.
if you have the information in hand to say, there's a high likelihood that these areas are going to be, heavily impacted by storm events and damaged. Whether you could say, go ahead and go do it. And you certainly can say, hey, it's not my money, go ahead and make your investment. There's certainly some, I've seen certainly other areas where there are neighborhoods or areas that have been very flood prone. And it's a question of, in severe events, having to send people out to try to save people in those areas, literally. And again, if you have the information about it, how do you want these areas to potentially either be developed in the future? And so that's, some of the, so if you think it makes more sense to make people aware, before they do something with like the future flood prone area, and that seems to make sense, then the question is, okay, well, what are we talking about for these areas that we're even more certain that there's a risk that exists right now? And what should that look like 20 years from now? Should the investment in those areas be limited? Or should they have to, think about potentially elevating, those types of things? So, it's a good question. It becomes, the federal government has realized they're not doing something right because they don't have a program that can actually fund all the rebuild from the damage that's happening. So one way to try to address that is, stop the bleeding a little bit and have people change how they develop in these areas or not.
Well, it doesn't necessarily drive value to zero, does it? If there are.
No, I'm just saying, yeah, I'm just saying that, at some point, some of these areas, I know there's also in other states, they've been trying to come up with things like 3 strikes, you're out. How many times do you get to rebuild in the same location that's high hazard? And at some point, that'll be, you're no further or without any subsidy.
I think one of the things I've heard from other communities, in addition to the concerns about the safety of public safety folks, is sort of the commitment to ongoing services to areas that may not be viable in the future, that encouraging people to build in places that you can predict. If it's in a V zone, that means they expect 3-foot or greater waves, in a 1% chance storm today. And that, so presumably that will get worse. So that's part of it, I think, is, you build roads, you build properties, the city owns the services to those, and those may get harder and harder to maintain.
At what point, if this becomes more restrictive, does it become kind of a eminent domain issue?
So that, and maybe that's something else we could put in the drive. The Chatham barred all new construction in the flood zones, and that case went to the state Supreme Court, and they found there basically you can have very little property use left before it becomes you basically do have to get to zero. So they said, you could camp there, you could have a picnic table there, you could do some very minor things still, and so you still have use of your property. But I think it would be good that the CZM put together a little flyer about it, and I'll share that with Greg so he can pass it along, but I think it would be helpful to see.
Yeah, definitely helpful to see that.
My concern for this is, even if the SJC says that it's not a taking, Gloucester residents are still going to perceive it as a reduction in their value, and that will be true. If you can only put a picnic table instead of build a house, that's way different. And these waterfront properties are hugely valuable right now. So
it really becomes a question of whether there's anything left on the property outside of these zones that is buildable, right?
yeah,
Because if there's something, if you're showing an elevation line and you're doing a setback and you've got nothing left, then you've got zero, right? But if you've still have some area, it just means that you're going to be restricted in what you might be able to build in that area. I just kind of look at it over the long term and say, this just makes common sense. For regardless of the market issue for the moment, that isn't this aren't these the kind of regulations that we should be considering, given what is coming down the pike?
I agree with you in an ideal world, and I actually agree with you philosophically and politically and in every other way, except that I'm a little raw from the recent interactions with the public. And, there are plenty of, if you look at that map, there are plenty of properties in Gloucester that are completely in the VE zone with no, it's not a question of moving your building back out of the VE zone.
But I think the practical part of that, Jane, is that people that are in homes today that will be affected by this aren't going to be adding 2,500 square foot additions to their
Right.
homes.
Yes,
Right,
I can get behind that. It's the no residential construction on any VE zone property that I find.
Right, but how many lots does that affect today, right? I mean, and I think that number is small.
Well, if any of them were on Eastern Point or Bass Rocks, we're toast. Just saying.
We've got, plenty of time before this happens, right? I mean, so.
Yeah, I know.
Be aware, right? And
Yes.
If you decide to move forward and your house gets wrecked, you'll have to sell another house to pay for this one, right? I mean, but I think the reality is that the taking issue, and I understand where you're coming from. I've heard the same discussions, right? I mean, and it seems, and I don't know, and we probably know the count. It's probably less than 20 lots, I would imagine, that are not built that we fall. I mean, we've had this discussion years ago, right? But I mean, it's a state thing. We can't, turn our backs on it, right? I mean, we have to comply. And so the problem is really with the State House and not with the City Hall.
What did you say?
So my point is that this is a top-down thing, not a city, a locally generated ordinance, even though our ordinances will reflect the state requirements for no building in the velocity zones. So it's,
Wait, is there a state requirement for no building in the velocity zone?
No, there's a proposal that was supposed to be put out for public hearings this past spring that hasn't happened. So
why don't we just let the state be the
well,
bad guy?
and that's perfectly fine too. I mean, I think back to, and once you take a look at this document, other than putting some sort of either prohibition or numerical standard on addition, this ordinance is what we'll have to probably do 2 years from now. That the State Office of Floodplain Management is going to send an email out to the chief elected official in the city and say, you need to do this in the next 6 months to stay compliant. And that's what Ann has provided, which is mostly the bulk language with some clarification. Putting any additional standard, the blue language in these two zones, is really what we wanted to kind of press more on that discussion. Do you think we should do this? Do you think we should wait and see how it shakes out at either the other jurisdictional level, or consider it at some other time? Let's see how this operates and decide. You can respond as you see things that come before the city as well, and decide, what, maybe that's the direction we should be heading. If you don't feel like there's enough evidence right now to do that, then I would say it's that section that we would just remove, and it really just establishes the jurisdiction. It has that longer dialogue and a permitting process of, have you thought about this? Where is the floodplain, for every board to be seeing, and that jurisdiction, as well as, where are areas that might be impacted in the future? Have you thought about this? Would you consider this? And that's, that's the starting point beyond what we have right now, which is very little discussion of those issues. And when they're raised, mostly an applicant will say, oh, we're going to go to the Conservation Commission. So we'll deal with that when we get there.
So if I'm understanding this correctly, what's in the document, the blue language is the new language that we're adding on top of the state standard. Is that correct, Ann? So when
Yes.
we're looking at that, okay. So, and Greg, just say again, and you may have addressed this, when is this expected to be in front of the state?
So this began with a working group at the state level in 2014. They met periodically over almost a decade now, and it is establishing regulations through the Wetlands Protection Act, because that also identifies the same jurisdiction, land subject to coastal storm flowage. And Ann's seen presentations at conferences. They actually invited communities to participate in, kind of an information session, and said, this is coming in the end of May, the beginning of June. Here it is, black and white. This is what we're proposing to do. It's been through DEP legal office. It's been through, all of the jurisdictions have said, yes, go forward and adopt these amendments to the Wetland Protection Act regulations. And here we are in July.
Yeah,
Okay.
I think it's unclear. It seems like I'm told it's at some yet higher level, and I don't know if, the end of Baker's term means this isn't going to happen, or I would assume, they've put in, as Greg was saying, they've publicized exactly what they intend to do, which made me think they were going to do it, but they haven't. So maybe it waits for the next governor. I don't know.
So to Jane's point, it seems that the issue for us is, do we wait for this? Are we in a better position if the state has passed this and then we're adding on some additional restrictions, right? Or do we forge ahead? But can we even forge ahead with this if the state has not changed their regulations?
You can. Other communities have restricted new construction in the V zone. It puts you out ahead. I fully understand the why not let the state take the heat for this argument.
Yep.
You would be, among less than 10, maybe less than half a dozen communities that have taken that step already that didn't wait.
Do you have the list of those communities? I'd just be curious.
Yeah,
I don't need to see it now. You could send it to us.
Rockport is one of them.
Interesting.
So I don't know if anybody's ever
Was
chatted.
that their last zoning push, Rockport?
I don't know. I looked up everybody's floodplain ordinances and found that was one of them. And actually, I think if I have it right in front of me. Situate is one, Chatham is one. I think I put the list in my notes. Let me see if I can quick find it. Chatham, Oak Bluff, Situate, Rockport is what I found.
Okay.
Many communities have done this, although more inland than coastal. I think, more like, when I say many, over a dozen have done some restriction on the expansion in A zones, different percentages. That's a little more common than the B zone.
And do we know whether those have actually been really challenged harder? You mentioned the Chatham situation, but in Rockport, as an example, was there a huge hue and cry over this?
I don't know. That might be a conversation to have.
I'll
do some research on that one.
Yeah.
I'd just be curious because, if we're talking about a limited number of properties, that's one thing. And if this has gone through in other communities and it hasn't been significantly challenged by people, are we thinking that this is more of an issue than it actually is?
That's a great point. I read something in the Gloucester Daily Times about Rockport's recent zoning thing, and they have town meeting. And so whatever they did, it was very successful. And they also pre-sold it really well.
Right. And besides the fact that they've lost all their Conservation Commission.
Yes.
Folks.
That, yes.
Well, I know it wasn't in this most recent round, but
Right.
I don't know how long they've had the V zone prohibition language there.
Okay.
So I'm in the interest of time, because I know Jane's got to go at 5. Do you want to keep this discussion in this setting? We'll post everything up for everybody to take a look at, but have you guys meet again before we bring this up at the full planning board?
I would say yes.
Yeah,
Me
I think
too.
so.
I'm
So-
not fully formed in my opinions yet.
Yep.
Right.
Okay.
Exactly.
We'll do that then.
Can I suggest, I can't do anything next week, but how about if we did 2 weeks from today?
Yeah, I would think we'll do off cycle. We have a regular planning board meeting next Thursday night or Thursday at 5. So we can look to the following week, which would be the week of the 25th. I can't remember how long Beverly was out of town. I'm figuring she's
remember.
probably gone for at least a week or maybe more.
I'm away starting the 28th and the following week.
Okay,
in
do
case
you want to shoot for a Wednesday afternoon tentatively?
Wednesday, the 27th is open for me.
Me too.
Okay. Time of day? 3?
3,
Later
2?
or 4 even, would that work?
4 is fine.
4 is fine, yeah.
Okay.
Great.
Even 5 is fine for me.
On Jane.
Let's see what, ooh.
You know,
I just looked on, I think I'm double booking myself.
Tuesday afternoon?
Does Tuesday work?
Tuesday's
Hold on.
fine.
Hold on,
Tuesday,
let
the
me check.
26th. Yeah,
Okay, why don't we do that? And what,
Mhm.
did you say 4 or 5?
4,
Either.
4.
4.
4
Sure.
o'clock. Sounds great.
So sorry, that's Tuesday, the 26th
At 4 p.m.
at
4
4.
p.m.
Got it.
Great. And we
We
will
need to-
load all this up.
Perfect. And so the hope would be that we would all have had a chance to review that more closely before that meeting. From a formality standpoint, do we take a vote to have to close this or not?
Yes, you do. A motion to adjourn.
The motion,
So
may I have a
moved.
motion? Do we have a second? Thank you, Mr. Newton.
Okay,
Your
Member
place right
Rosen.
now, David.
Do we have to vote?
Yes,
Yeah.
Member
Yes,
Rosen.
okay. Roll
Member
call vote.
Remsen, Member Remsen
Yes.
and Member Noonan.
Yes.
Okay, well, we'll see you
Yes.
next Thursday if you can make that meeting. I hope so. And then we will also send out a reminder for the meeting on the 22nd.
So Greg, do we know for the meeting next week, is it on Zoom or in person?
As far as we know right now, we've posted it for Zoom. We will wait to see what happens tomorrow. That's the deadline for the legislature to take some sort of action. And if not, I'm not sure we'll figure something out by Monday morning if we're going to try to do an in-person meeting and where that will be.
So you'll notify us.
Yes, we definitely will.
All right, thank you.
Okay.
Thank you all.
Have a good weekend. Thanks, Ann.
Thanks.
Bye,
Greg, can you
everybody.
stay
Thank
on
you.
for a second?
Bye-bye.
Yes, yes.
Thanks.
All right, and Gemma, if you can.
Hi.
So I don't know if there's a way for me to stop the recording, so I'll have to,
Oh, do you have to post the recording?
well, no, I mean, this will just be continue on the end of the meeting that we
But I
we
mean, do you have
post,
to end up posting it? So
we
you-
post them all.
Oh, so
We post all of our meetings. Do you want to jump into a Google Meet?
sure. Can you do that?
I will send you an invite right
Okay.
away.
All right.
Okay,